We are now going to bring to a conclusion our discussion of answering the objections to Isaiah 53, speaking of Yeshua, the Messiah. The most positive thing is just to read the chapter and say, who does this speak about? But we are covering the many different objections that we get hit with. After doing that, I want to loop back to a theological objection, something that I cover in volume 2 of my series, Answering Jewish Objections to Jesus, but I didn't cover in dealing with theological objections in the first class of these two classes, namely the question of, is there a suffering Messiah in Judaism in the Bible? Is there really a suffering Messiah? Is there vicarious suffering that the Messiah undergoes? So we're going to come back to that, and then we'll move on with more Messianic prophecy. So the last two objections that are raised about Isaiah 53 applying to Jesus. Number one, Isaiah 53 cannot refer to him because it says that the servant of the Lord would not lift up his voice, cry out, and yet Yeshua cried out on the cross. He even cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? I had counter-missionary rabbis tell me that was near blasphemy. Well, it wasn't near blasphemy when David or the psalmist spoke it. And in fact, when Yeshua cries that out, he's drawing our attention to Psalm 22, which is ultimately an extraordinary messianic psalm. And we'll see about that in a future lecture here. But the whole message of Isaiah 53 is that he didn't resist slaughter. He went like a lamb to the slaughter. He didn't protest. He didn't try to defend himself. He didn't try to fight. He didn't let his servants fight, his disciples. He didn't let them fight. So one of the most striking things when you read the accounts of the Gospels is how Yeshua did not try to defend himself and did not call for 10,000 angels to come and fight. All he had to do is snap his fingers and God would dispose whatever was needed. No, he didn't do that because his purpose was to come and die. And the whole image of turning the other cheek and nonviolent resistance that Gandhi learned, he learned a lot of it from Jesus, and Martin Luther King from Gandhi and Jesus. That's because he modeled it exactly what Isaiah 53 was talking about. It's not saying he will never speak out, he will never raise his voice. It's saying that he did not resist going to slaughter. He didn't raise his voice against that. He didn't protest. He didn't try to fight. And that's exactly what happened. But in fact, some of these objections are so weak, even though sincere, that they show how powerful the passage is on its own. Lastly, we're told Isaiah 53 cannot refer to Yeshua because it says the servant of the Lord would see seed. Your Ezra. He will see seed. And I was told in one debate that expression, see seed in the Bible, always means physical progeny. Well, actually, that expression, see seed, only occurs there. One Jewish translation suggests that the word zerah actually should be understood as zeroah, arm. He'll see the arm of the Lord, namely the vindication of the Lord. But let's just say we use the Hebrew text as we have it. And zerah, seed, what does it mean? He will see seed. Well, does it mean that he will, after his death and resurrection, now have children? Is that what it means? Could be. That could be a meaning. But zerah can be used metaphorically in terms of a spiritual seed, seed of serpents, seed of evildoers. It can be used metaphorically. So it could be speaking of spiritual offspring in the future. It also could mean he will see future generations of his people. Like it says at the end of Psalm 22 that a seed will serve him, a future generation. It could just mean that he will see the future results of his labor. He will see future disciples, future seed of Jewish people, or perhaps Jews and Gentiles following the God of Israel through his labor. It does not mean that he had children. It does not have to mean that. The fact is, all these different objections thrown out at this, it's almost like someone microanalyzing the Mona Lisa and saying it's really not a masterpiece. There's really not much to it. Well, why have people been enthralled by it through the centuries? Or maybe here's a wholesome model with a beautiful face and a beautiful smile, and she's wearing this just lovely, modest summer dress, and on the front of a modest magazine, trying to paint a picture that's as modest and clean as could be. And she's vibrant, and you look at that and say, wow, she just looks so wholesome, and what a beautiful smile, what a beautiful woman. Well, you know, if you break that down, we did a computer analysis, and we see that the lip is not perfectly even. Now, actually, you'll see she's like a little crease in them. They have photoshopped that little, you know, the hair, that's not an install. So you can critique it, but she looks very beautiful. Well, when we look at Isaiah 53, you can try to come at it with these different objections, but when you step back and see the power of it, you think, wow, it sounds as if someone wrote it, as has often been said, at the foot of the cross. Now, let me get into this question, though, of suffering. Does Judaism know of a suffering Messiah? In volume 2 of my series, Answering Jewish Objections to Jesus, I have the following objections that we raise. Jews don't believe in a divine Messiah. And we have answered that by showing how God's unity is complex. That was in our first class. God's unity is complex, and he reveals himself on earth through the divine Son. And that there are even Messianic prophecies that can only rightly be understood, fully understood, with reference to a divine Messiah. Then the argument, Jews don't believe in a suffering Messiah, and Jews don't believe the Messiah will come twice. Well, with regard to Jews not believing that the Messiah will come twice, we saw in the first class that you have different pictures, Zechariah 9, the Messiah coming meek and lowly, riding on a donkey, Daniel 7, the Messiah coming in clouds of glory and great power. Which will it be, one or the other? The Talmud asks, which will it be? Coming in the clouds, coming meek and lowly? Will it be both? It'll be both. First meek and lowly, then riding on the clouds, as happened, and as Yeshua said, would happen. And then we go to a passage like Isaiah 52, 13 to 15, which makes clear that the one who will be highly exalted, this one who will be highly and greatly exalted, will first suffer terribly. So one Messiah, two phases to his mission. We know he will do the rest of the work. We know he will return and establish peace on the earth and destroy the wicked from the earth and bring the universal knowledge of God. We know he will do that because he did everything he had to do in the first phase of his mission, and we see it continuing to unfold. We see through Isaiah 42 that the Messiah will be a light to the nations and will set the captives free. And we see that he will continue in this mission even though he has to persevere. We see in Isaiah chapter 49 that it seems that he's failed in his mission to regather Israel. And yet God says, not only will you do that, but you will be a light to the nations. And ultimately, kings will bow down before you. We see in Isaiah 50 that the servant suffers attack and disfigurement. And then we see in Isaiah 52 and 53 that the Messiah's suffering was not for his sin, but for the sin of the people, the sin of the nation, the sin of all of us. Isaiah 53:6, one of my favorite verses in Hebrew, it begins and ends with the word kulanu, all of us. Kulanu katson ta'inu. All of us like sheep went astray. Ish ledarko paninu. Each man turned to his own way. Adonai hifgia bo et avon kulanu. But the Lord caused to light upon him the iniquity of all of us. All of us strayed. The sins of all of us were put on him, and by his wounds were healed. The great revelation as Jewish eyes open up to the reality of this mission. And at the end of the age, kings and leaders will be utterly shocked. There's a Muslim world that will be shocked to realize that this Jesus that they didn't think was crucified, didn't die for our sins, was not the Son of God, comes in the clouds of glory. There'll be others that are God-denying nations and secularists and mock this message that will be absolutely shocked. It's him. And of course, to the extent that he is associated with Israel and the Jewish people, there will be shock for that as well. So what about this notion that Jews don't believe in a suffering Messiah? Well, first, the question is not what Jews believe and don't believe, but what does Scripture say? That being said, well, it's a misnomer. There are many traditions about suffering Messiah in Judaism. There are traditions preserved in the Talmud about the Messiah outside the gates of Rome, a leper, and changing his bandages just one at a time rather than all at once in case he's called on and Israel needs him, in case it's the time for redemption. And where do we get that from? We get that from Isaiah 53, that could be interpreted that the Messiah is smitten with leprosy. Judaism developed a doctrine of Mashiach ben Yosef, Messiah son of Joseph, who would suffer and die in the great war, last great war. And then the Messiah son of David would raise him up from the dead. The Messiah son of Joseph would fight many of the wars of the Lord. Some of the early medieval Jewish commentators and philosophers explained that if we were worthy, that Messiah son of David would come. If we were not worthy, first Messiah son of Joseph and then Messiah son of David. The Messiah son of Joseph would fight the wars of the Lord and then die. Some wonder if that teaching, that notion of Messiah son of Joseph, came out of the failed Jewish revolt of Bar Kokhba, 132 to 135, the failed second Jewish revolt. He was a mighty warrior. Rabbi Akiva hailed him as Messiah, and then, of course, his forces lost, and there was terrible, horrific suffering for the Jewish nation. But he was a warrior king. Is that where the idea of this warrior Messiah, but he dies in battle, is that where it came from? It's just pure speculation. But this idea of a suffering Messiah is something that Judaism has taught. Not only so, there are many Jews to this day who believe that there'll be two Messiahs, Mashiach ben Yosef, Mashiach ben David. There is even teaching about Messiah under the throne of God. There's a lengthy section in Pesikta Rabbati, which is around 8th, 9th century homilies, rabbinic homilies, where the Messiah is under the throne of God, suffering terribly and carrying the weight of the pains of the nation. I mean, you would have thought some Christian evangelist or Christian preacher wrote a bunch of this. It's amazing how strong and clear it is. And he's suffering and carrying the weight and the pains of the nation. And if he wasn't doing that, Israel would not be able to survive. So there are those traditions. There are mystical traditions that speak of the Messiah's suffering. And there's even a passage by Moshe Alshech, 500 years ago, a little over that, one of the great preachers of his era, where he comments on Zechariah, the 12th chapter, and says that speaks of the sufferings of Messiah there, Mashiach ben Yosef. And it says that his sufferings are vicarious, that his sufferings are for the sins of the nation. That's even taught as well. And then we saw in the first class how Judaism teaches about the atoning power of the death of the righteous. So atonement through suffering, redemption through suffering is certainly something that Judaism teaches and embraces. We have the most glorious picture of it laid out here in Isaiah 53. Some would tell us, no, you don't understand. There's no such thing as vicarious atonement in Judaism. I beg to differ with that. Now, of course, that's not a universal Jewish objection, but some have said that to me. There is vicarious atonement in the sacrificial system, life for life. The innocent sacrificial victim taking the place of the guilty sinner. It's taught there. It's taught in the Jewish notion of the atoning power of the death of the righteous. There's vicarious atonement there. And here's what's fascinating. There are traditional Jews who will say Isaiah 53 refers to the suffering of the righteous remnant or the suffering of the nation of Israel, and their suffering somehow brings healing, redemption to the world, or postpones judgment, or takes away wrath, or whatever. So there's vicarious atonement there, but when we apply it to the Messiah, people don't want to hear it. No, it's the great message of the Hebrew Scriptures, substitutionary atonement. Ultimately expressed here, Messiah took our place. He died so that we could live. It's an extraordinary and wonderful message. Okay, let's now move on to objections to the prophecies in Daniel. Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 to 27. We will be told first that these verses have nothing to do with the Messiah. It's the first thing we'll be told. They have nothing to do with the Messiah. Then we'll be told Daniel 9:24 was not fulfilled by Jesus. Then we will also be told that Christian translations of Daniel 9:24 to 27 divide the 70 weeks incorrectly, and the dates have no relation to the times of Jesus. These are the primary objections to the book of Daniel, these major prophecies. And then finally, that Daniel 9:24 to 27 speaks of two anointed ones. So again, we get the context first. we get the context first. In Daniel, the 9th chapter, Daniel's in exile. He's been in exile close to 70 years. He knows that Jeremiah has prophesied that the Jewish people will be in exile in Babylon for 70 years. He's praying, God, isn't it the time now? Aren't we getting close to the time of restoration and release from captivity? Not from 586, when the major captivity came, but when Daniel was taken some years earlier. Aren't we getting close? And God speaks to him and basically says, there's something bigger. There's something bigger than the return from exile. There's something bigger than these 70 years. It's actually a period of 77s, 70 weeks of years. In other words, not 70 years, but 490 years. And during this time, momentous things will happen. So this is big. This is bigger than the return from exile, Daniel. This is a special revelation that is being given to you. And with this revelation, I'm explaining things of critical importance in the life and history of the nation. Now, there are some Christian translations that say, make reference to Messiah with a capital M, or even the Messiah in this passage in Daniel 9, 24 to 27. I would say that's definitely a mistranslation. First, the word the does not occur before Mashiach in some of these passages. So to say the Messiah, wrong and misleading. So I agree with that critique. Shouldn't be. Also, even to translate with Messiah, with capital M there, could be misleading. Oh, is it Messianic prophecy? Ultimately, yes. Is it possible there are two anointed ones? Could be. You say, well, what? I don't get the connection between the anointed one and Messiah. Remember, Mashiach in Hebrew is an anointed one. And then the Mashiach, the anointed one, is the Messiah. But Mashiach in and of itself just means anointed one. So when Christian translations say anointed one or the anointed one or anointed one with a capital A, capital O, that could be potentially reading something into the text. I don't mind that as much as I mind putting Messiah there, because that could be misleading, even though the text ultimately speaks of the work of Messiah. Daniel was speaking of an anointed one, or we'll see, two anointed ones. We'll look at that. And then we find out what one of these anointed ones does, and it is to bring our redemption by dying for the sins of the world before the second temple was destroyed. So, wrong objection that the text has nothing to do with the Messiah. Right objection that our English translation should not render with the Messiah. So let's look at the text here. And I am going to read it to you from the English Standard Version, just because it's what I have in front of me. And we'll then comment on Jewish translations and different understandings. But since it's often the Christian translations that are being critiqued, I'll read a Christian translation. 70 weeks, 77s, are decreed about your people and your holy city to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity, to bring an everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint the most holy place, or holy thing, or holy one. Those are options given in the footnotes. Know therefore, and understand, that from the going out of the word to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks. Actually, the text says to restore and build, not rebuild Jerusalem. There shall be 7 weeks. Stop. Then for 62 weeks it shall be built again with squares and moat, but in a troubled time. Stop. And after the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war, desolations are decreed, and he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week. And for half of the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering, and on the wing of abomination shall come one who makes desolate until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. Well, the further we get into the passage, the more difficult it seems to be. But this much is clear. Something of tremendous and momentous importance is going to happen over this 490-year period. Are there gaps in it? How do we divide the weeks? Are the stops, the way I read the translations, is that in keeping with what the Hebrew says, or the Masoretic accentuation? Is it a misreading there? We'll cover all those things. We'll cover all those things. When does it start? When does it end? We'll cover all that. Well, here's what's clear. And here's my recommendation in dealing with this passage. Major on the majors. There is a period of 490 years within which these 6 things must happen. And they are of such importance that they overshadow Daniel's prayer for the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the rebuilding of the temple and the restoration of the exiles. In other words, yeah, that's going to happen, but there's something that's going to happen once it's rebuilt in Daniel. That's what I want to talk to you about. So let's notice this again. From the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there should be 7 weeks. So it could be from this starting point, the Latin term used, nice little Latin term, terminus a quo, the time from which. This part to this part, is that going to be 49 years and there's an anointed one and this one's involved with rebuilding the temple and so on? And who is that anointed one? Well, fair questions. And then is that followed by a period then of 434 years, the 62 weeks? And then after that, there's another anointed one. It seems to be 2 separate anointed ones. Could well be. But what then happens, these 6 things that are spoken of must come to pass. There's even debate about some of the translation of these. Finish the transgression, put an end to sin, atone for iniquity, bring in everlasting righteousness, seal both vision and prophet, and anoint a most holy place. Am I saying this is messianic primarily because it says Mashiach? No. I'm saying it's messianic primarily because of the momentous nature of what must happen before the second temple was destroyed. Now, there are some critical scholars that don't believe in predictive prophecy and don't believe that Daniel was written by or about a character who lived 500-600 years before the time of Yeshua. They believe it was someone who lived in the 2nd century, so maybe 150 years before the time of Yeshua, or a little longer than that. And it was written about events taking place in his day with the Maccabees and the restoring of the temple and the battle with Antiochus Epiphanes and so on. The problem is there's nothing that momentous that happens. That, yeah, the temple's rededicated and the Greek power is broken and there is a time of Jewish freedom for that season. But how can you say it finished transgression or put an end to sin? Or atoned for iniquity, brought in everlasting righteousness. You really can't. You really can't. Now, we'll deal with the counter-missionary objections to this shortly. But let's just say first that to just apply it to things that may have happened in the days of the Maccabees doesn't work. So what actually happened and what was the great importance of this prophecy? Well, you say if we could just find out when this began, going forth of the word to restore and build Jerusalem. You know, there's great debate about that. Some say that's the decree of Cyrus, which took place shortly after this, the decree of Cyrus to rebuild the temple. The problem is if you have the 490 years consecutively, that winds you up well before the time of Yeshua and well before these final momentous things happen with the destruction of the temple. Others say, well, it's when Daniel spoke this word. This was it, or when Gabriel spoke it to Daniel. We don't have the exact date on that, but again, it's hard to line up. Others would say, yeah, but there was a decree of Artaxerxes. It was like 445 BC. And if you look at a prophetic year, like a prophetic year is 360 days versus 365 days, and we can prove that. And if you'll do that and then compute from 445, it gets you right up to the time of the crucifixion of Yeshua. Well, that's quite amazing. And yeah, look at every detail. And wow, that's quite amazing. The problem is it's a bit of an obscure decree to say that was the decree to start it, and then the 360 days, the prophetic calendar, and so on. It's somewhat debatable. So what do I do with this? I look at what we know, that at some point in time this begins, and we have a definite end point, a terminus ad quem, a time until which we have a definite final point, and the definite final point ends with this. Jerusalem is destroyed, the temple's destroyed, a Roman prince, Roman leader sacks the city and brings desolation. So before that happens, before the second temple was destroyed, all these things need to unfold and come to pass. So when we come back in our next class, we will look at a few more specifics here and then show how in detail these do apply to Jesus the Messiah and how it is legitimate for us to use Daniel chapter 9 as a messianic prophecy. We don't cover every single messianic prophecy in these lectures. What we're trying to do is look at the largest objections, the biggest things to overcome, and then to do that clearly. When we finish that, we'll then give a brief overview of New Testament objections and traditional Jewish objections to Yeshua being our Messiah.